Welcome to another episode of the Institute for Conflicts Individuation Podcast. I am Dr. Lahab Al Samurai. With me is Karen Apple and Isaac J. Miller from the Daily Archetype.
Whoa.
And we are going to discuss Maurice Stein's Jung's The Map of the Soul. And we are on we're on chapter 5. And the heading of the chapter, I will tell you after Karen introduces herself or does some chit chat with you. And
Sure.
Isaac tries to speak also. I know he has a hard time with that. Okay, Karen, take it away.
All right. So I'm excited to be back for my third guest appearance on this excellent podcast.
You seem to be a regular now. Third appearance is usually regular, but
You tried to back out. We wouldn't let you.
but as soon as I say you're regular, something happens and it implodes. So I'm trying not to say you're regular, but at the same time, it's itching me. Sorry, go on.
Well, I'm here and I'm happy to be here and I'm glad to be here and I'm excited to talk about chapter 5, the revealed and the concealed in relation with others, the persona and shadow.
I think the best part of this chapter is the title.
That's the best part. It's all downhill from there.
It's done.
Otherwise, it becomes very, very, what's the word for it? Sticky inside the chapter. But that title is very
Probably
clean.
not as sticky as last week.
Yeah,
The
last
title
week
is
was
clean.
sticky.
I like the title. The title is very clean.
Well,
Reveal
the
and
titles are
conceal.
always good, but the
titles
inside
are
it
very
can get
good, yeah.
sticky.
Yeah, it was.
It's the nature of the consciousness.
You're right, though. It's really pretty straightforward
Ooh.
when you look at it at the simple
Well-
title.
As soon as you start reading and it's like, oh, there's ego personality, personality, so-and-so personality. I'm like, what the?
I will throw a twist on the title since you guys love it so much. The twist that I would throw on it is that when I read that, or it makes me think of actually one objection, and that it's not just in relation to others, it's also in relation to, I might even say something like relation to individuals, because it's also in relation to yourself. So
Yeah, true.
to say others almost confuses it, but it does sort of clarify that in the chapter, that the ego consciousness, or the consciousness of the individual, has its own role in all this, and that and its own role is partly deceptive, in that it wants to keep the shadow in the dark, and sometimes it believes the persona is really it, and sometimes it doesn't. So that's the little twist that I would put on the lovely title of the chapter.
But I would say that, not to argue with you, because
Sure.
I personally don't like to argue. But I would say, did I lie? Yes, I did. Okay.
Okay.
I would say that the concealed in relations with others is what you're talking about. That's my only quip. The quip
Mm.
is that covers your. But anyway, we're never going to get past. We're not going to get past page 1. Now, come on.
No, we won't even get to page 1.
Let's
We're
get
just gonna be on
into
the chapter
persona,
title.
shadow. Who wants to take persona? Karen, take persona.
You have such a good persona, Karen.
Oh.
Tell
Yes,
us about
very
persona.
well organized. It's very integrated and very
Very.
integral to order.
Mhm.
Yeah,
The
Don't
queen
see
archetype.
Karen out of order.
Mhm.
No.
You don't see her doing anything that is a tiny bit out. No,
She even put a Santa hat on the skeleton behind her.
exactly.
Very
Key
orderly.
details.
And he's like modeling with his just propped himself up.
If you're going to be skin and bones, you better wear a nice hat, Mommy said.
That's what the queen says. All right, tell us about persona.
Okay, so the persona. So the persona is it's what we show, or what others see when they see us. It's what we show to the world. It's and it's adaptable to different, or changeable to different situations. In different situations, what you show to the world might change.
Mhm.
So it's, I would say it's adaptable, it's changes, and it's usually what is allowing you to meet social norms. So you're not really controversial in generally speaking. It's your way of fitting in.
Mhm.
So it would be the adaptive phase that we carry into world.
Yeah.
Yeah.
How to adapt to culture around you.
Yes.
So it would be
Exactly.
a give and take. He later talks about ambition,
Mhm.
which sends it in a different direction. But the beginning, you're right, Karen. That's exactly what's going on. What's also fascinating is when he starts talking about persona, he differentiates it in a way from ego, and that within it, the persona has its own identification with world, separate and apart from ego,
Yeah.
and that actually ego identifies itself with persona.
Mhm.
I thought that was interesting. I don't know. What did you think, Karen?
Well, then he continues in what I was really, I really loved the discussion that was when he talks about the difference between, or the struggle between the I-ness and the dependence, or like the social, adhering to the social norms. It's like you want to be, it's like autonomy versus dependence. That was some intense writing.
Ooh.
I thought that was super interesting. It's like this pool between opposites, and I feel that a lot. Like this, I feel a need for autonomy, and I'm also aware of the positive things that come with, I call it groupthink. So it can be
Such
fun,
a queen
like,
thing to say.
like I get the unwavering loyalty to a sports team, you know, like it's like your team no matter what, and then like you're a big hater on the other teams, but like I can't jump in because I like want both teams to win, and I want to root on the rookies on both teams because I'm so proud of them for their little rookie selves. Like, you go, rookie.
These are archetypal energies attached to images. So these energies chase these images. Think of it in the old days as watching a real fine-tuned hunters out in the middle of nowhere throwing spears at wild animals that will feed you, how they take them down, how they run towards them, how they hide. This is archetypal. This is a sports arena. Even in old Roman times, the gladiators would be thrown in with warriors. They would thrown in these wild animals they got from Africa. They throw them in. They throw a bunch of swords and knives and let them fight it out like madness. So this is all archetypal. This has all been prearranged so that when we start to channel our energies into these things, what we are channeling energy is to the archetype.
Yeah.
We are basically being pulled in. We're hooked by the archetype. That's why Michael Jordan, when he does something, you go, wow, he's amazing. He's playing with the ball, by the way. Wow. Because that's the archetype. The archetype is what you could do with a small bouncy ball. All these other people around you cannot do.
What it reminds me of is the story I read in, I think it was volume 1 of Joseph Campbell's Mask of God, where he tells this story of, I think he spent time with, I don't know, some African tribe or something. But anyway, they had this big hunt for some antelope or whatever it was. I don't know, some big animal. And they planned out exactly beforehand, like they drew in the ground or whatever, exactly what that they were going to do and where exactly that the arrow was going to land to, you know, they drew it on the ground or whatever to where exactly where the arrow was going to land to slay this this animal. And it happened like down to the centimeter, you could almost say, of exactly how they planned it. And that's what we did for like a million plus years, is that same type of activity. And so that's why we identify so strongly with things like sporting individuals, or people in sports. And it's because we want to identify with them in our that becomes part of our persona. And that, to get to this chapter, and that we get to the whole point where it's like, I'm a Lakers fan and I hate Clippers fans, or I hate Bulls fans, or whatever, where of course that's kind of silly, because it's like, corporations
The
fighting each other.
archetypal irritation.
Yeah.
Irritation between the archetypes. They
Right.
start rubbing against each other like enemies.
Right.
It only increases your connection to the game.
Right.
So the more irritation your voice with the other teams and the other people is, the more you're entrenched in the archetype.
Right.
It has you by every hook.
Yeah, especially when Americans, we just kind of do silly things, like have stupid arguments like that. But in other countries, I mean, I don't know if it happens much or at all in America, but in other countries, it's like a regular thing where people will have arguments over soccer games, and sometimes kill each other, or beat each other to death almost, and have like there, in Europe and South America, where how soccer games go, or football as they would say, people's lives depend on it, and it gets tied into gangs and everything else. So this is persona identification, in that they need their team to be a certain way because they identify with it in their ego. And then what that does to kind of like get into this sort of opposite side of it is the shadow. So sometimes we think, like, if we're just around our fans of our team or whatever, then we think everything is all like we are virtuous saints of the world because we're just around our Lakers fans or Manchester United or whatever. But then,
don't you dare.
Yeah, exactly. Then the shadow comes out when somebody touches that ego identity.
We won today. Don't you dare. Okay, go on.
Oh no, I'm just saying generally. So, but that's how it works. Is you over-identify with one side, and then the opposite side becomes polarized the other way. And so that's just one example, but that can go into like any area in life where we over-identify with one side, and then the opposite side can unconsciously become even to the point of evil, where we can do all kinds of horrible things.
So
in that name.
before you go into shadow, go into shadow, because we are going to go there.
Sure.
But the identification with the persona is the identification with the archetype. So the persona of sports in general, or identification with the hunter,
right,
with precision, with warrior.
Right.
It is not identification with lover.
Right.
It is watching warriors on the field to show their excellence on the field. Who is better than who? Who could outwit who? Who could play whom?
Right.
Who's going to be victorious at the end?
And who's going to be the lead hunter, or the quarterback, or the star?
This is an age-old story of how hero rises, right?
Yeah. This goes back at least to the Ice Age or before.
But within that arena, that's warrior arena. Now, you might have magicians, you might have lovers, you might have queens, but that is a warrior arena. That's why most of them, you could tell they're warriors because how they shave heads.
Very archetypal.
Yes, that comes back, always comes back. It's like as much as we move forward, we come back. We find ways to identify with the archetype in a different way, but we do the same thing.
It's funny that just as you mentioned the head shaving, where Also now it's becoming a bigger and bigger thing. Didn't used to be like even in the 80s or 90s, but where almost every single professional sports player has like an abundance of tattoos, which is very
Yeah.
tribal, very, very like warrior like tribal.
Well, the 70s and 80s, they had long hair. They were Hercules.
Yeah.
They all had very long hair, and it wavered and they moved, and their hair was all over their face.
Yeah.
But it didn't matter because on television it looked great.
Right.
So hair, showing who you are, like peacock, showing who
Lion's
you are.
mane.
Yes.
Or like the tribal feather hat,
Yes.
things like that. Yeah.
Yes, definitely.
Mm-hmm.
So persona has its own following in the world.
Right.
And I think this is what we're saying from this chapter. It has its own following. It has its own kind of, and each type of persona, this archetype is very distinct. At the same time, it is same archetype. We think it's distinct. We think our relationship with the team is distinct. Like we're fans, so they appreciate us in a way that they don't see us.
Well, you're right. But what's tricky about it is like with every archetype, and some people say all archetypes are complexes, but it's sort of true. But the reality is they are the universal archetype. Like every single person ever has some sort of a persona and a shadow and all these others that we talk about. But so there's the universal way that it is, and that you could say is the archetype of the persona. And then on the individual level, that's more like the personalized individual complex, just like we can get a personalized individual complex of how the mother or father or these different kind of archetypal energies are. We get a more individual complex, and same thing with the shadow. The shadow can actually be a healthy, life-giving thing once we get the complexes under control and get the shadow integrated. Same thing with all the archetypes and all the complexes. This is like the whole point of individuation, is to overcome the complexes like you do in Jamp, and then you have a healthy natural flow of energy rather than getting caught on all these complexes. So there's everybody has persona, like everybody ever, but some people have a very maladapted complex attached to it, and that's also what helps develop more of a shadow.
Yes, and within the development of the shadow, what happens to us? We start to develop a side of us that is, Stein makes a point of calling it dubious. He uses a different word, but he says it has a sinister aspect to it.
Right.
I agree to a point, but then later on he fixes that with, if somebody's too identified with shadow, then their opposite is different. But he's still saying shadow, there's an evil element to it. I don't think so. I think there is an opposition element in the shadow. I think it has its own, like spark. Like if the ego has a spark that runs it, makes it numinous, the shadow, because it's an archetype, also has its own spark. So the way it approaches world is very different from the other.
Well, the way I think of it, and I'd be interested in what you both think of this, is just that. So, okay, we've been talking a little bit about archaic man, as you might say, or us in a tribal setting. And in a tribal setting, we're sort of living like good, in the environment, natural animals. And so we're going to do all kinds of things like poop anywhere or kill things and all those things that now we call evil, and treat people in maybe aggressive ways that now it's like, oh, that's evil. So that is to say that now we have more shadow issues because of what comes about in civilization, making this over identification with persona, and at the same, and because in our over identification with a civilized persona, it has to be like, you have to walk a certain way, you have to go to certain places and not to other places, and you can be around these people but not these people, and if you do this you have to keep it secret. And that's where the shadow starts to develop, is where it's like there's these so it comes from civilization.
But it has its own spark. What I'm saying, Isaac,
Yeah.
is that the shadow spark is independent of good and evil,
Oh,
like,
yeah.
like the ego spark. These things that attract all the energy towards them, they are different from good and evil, except when they are overcharged.
Well,
Well, overcharge means that the little kid, when sees the other kid fall and hit face and bleed, and the more they cry, the more they bleed, the more they laugh, then the archetype is overcharged. And I think that leads to sociopathy, but that's a different conversation, a different time. But I think it's the archetype. Karen, what do you think?
Yeah, what do you think about all this?
So I feel like you're just saying that, like, you're saying overcharged, but is it like over identification with the archetype? Like, it talks about in the previous chapter that over identification with the archetype, you get sucked in and you get this overinflated sense, and that can lead to psychopathology, is what was discussed a little bit in the other chapter, and that's kind of what you just said reminded me of.
No, if you think about people like Genghis Khan, that part of them was overcharged. And we don't have many Genghis Khans, but we've had many rulers that have destroyed populations all over the world for different reasons. But I think the archetype, the shadow archetype, is overcharged. I think when they are born, it's overcharged. It already clings to the energies of destruction, of control, of domination, these are energies, and these energies are connected to the archetypes. As much as the ego has these energies, it tries to create things that are peaceful and loving and caring, but it also creates rockets. Some of them go to the moon and some of them blow up other places.
Yeah.
Well, I wonder if this is kind of touching on a nurture versus nature discussion, because if someone's persona is not, or if someone's persona is shaped by society and they have this underlying energy to be a certain way, but then society is like, you have to hide that, then that's going to kind of push it into the shadow, and maybe that continues to happen, and maybe that shadow gets more charged.
Possibly.
Or are you saying that it's more of an underlying?
Possible. I am throwing out the idea.
Yeah.
The possibility.
I think it was
that archetype.
I think it was Melanie Klein who discovered there's such a thing as selfish babies. And the reason that's important to what you mentioned as far as nature versus nurture, there is an element where naturally, and you can, if you just watch babies, you can see there's some like 1, 2, 3-year-olds that will like try to share with other people and do lots of like benevolent things for a child that barely knows what's going on in the world. And then there's others. I think it's more rare, and there may be other elements to it, maybe to how that they were dealt with when they were tiny, but they're very selfish and stingy and just look like they behave like evil children and a lot of things like that. So there is a genetic element to it, and there is also, and so many things are that way. And but there is also the
but maybe it's not genetic, maybe it's archetypal.
Yes, it's
both.
It's not
meaning born with it.
Well, yeah, but the archetype manifests in the genome, or in that it comes down genetically. That's why part of that is like a lot of times if you see those aggressive babies, they're usually their father or sometimes their mother or others in their family were the same way, and some to some degree. Aggression sometimes is archetypally and genetically handed down, but that can be
What you're talking about, Isaac, because I think I don't want people to get confused.
okay.
I think because you stated it as it's handed down genetically. It's not. The archetype is yes, there's a genetic component which we call the instincts,
Yeah.
but the archetype itself is not an instinct. Which we
Yeah, well, it's
earlier because
universal. It's universal, but some people are more prone towards certain behavior than others to the point that Karen brought up as far as
these
nurture
are the
versus
archetypal
nature.
energies, right? We're talking about archetypal energies. We're not
Hmm.
talking about genetics. We're not talking about the instincts. We're talking about archetypal energies that move us in certain directions, that force us into certain situations, that make us something we're obviously not. For whatever reason.
Well, but these archetypal energies manifest through the mind, body, brain, and our body chemistry. And so some people being a different disposition genetically, even just men, for example, having a higher level of testosterone will sometimes react to situations differently
Fair
than
enough.
perhaps a woman. Uh,
Fair enough.
yeah,
But I still
yeah.
think that beyond that,
Right. There's a universal that transcends all of that.
we have energies within
Right.
us that propel us to do horrendous things or beautiful things, to
Yeah.
sacrifice or to give,
Mhm.
to take and plunder or to give back and build. We have those abilities. We've shown it and this is seen over and over again.
Mhm.
There's many that have come. And I think genetics is limiting the idea of the archetypal energies. And I don't
Oh,
think the archetypal energies are limited by genetics. What I can tell you is, yes, they react to genetics,
yeah.
but I think if the true archetypal energies, because we've seen people who are psychotic, we've seen them break down and start to scream of gods and goddesses and kindness and how they're going to be benevolent to people around them and to the people they love and how they're going to give things. These are archetypal energies. They are more powerful.
Well, and to also this point, perhaps more on the uh, environment level, which is everything, the physical environment and the social environment, but mainly the social environment. There is and he didn't get a lot into this in the shadow chapter as what I thought probably he should have a bit more, but this is a bit foundational, is the aspect of the group shadow. So, and to sort of the Genghis Khan point, but I think maybe especially since Jung talks about Hitler a lot, since he was in the area at that time, you could see the group shadow in the Aryan dreams and the Aryan, the German unconsciousness at that time manifesting. So if Hitler, for example, uh, for whatever reason, he wasn't in Germany at that time, he was in somewhere else, then he wouldn't have been Hitler, but very likely someone else could have fulfilled that same role, maybe a bit differently, but that role became so fulfilled and inhabited, similar to probably Genghis Khan, but it'd probably be a little bit different, where the group shadow of that time and place so longed for a something to take that sort of like a anti-hero position, although they thought it was a hero position at the time, that a person just came in and fulfilled it. So this gets into the aspect of uh the just like all those things that Genghis Khan did or Hitler did, it would be completely unacceptable in like today, for example, or other places in the world, but because they're in that time and place, they're able to fulfill that that group shadow along with their personal shadow.
But if you think about it, Isaac, the Germans from old days, they used to call them the barbarians from the north. They used to come to terrorize the Roman Empire, or from their point of view, they used to just try to get into the Roman Empire and have their own piece of land so they could be safe.
Oh yeah,
Whoever
for at least
story is
1,000
true,
years, or maybe
because
thousands
the
of years.
Romans say they're barbarians, and the barbarians, I am sure, felt the same thing about the Romans. But anyway, these warring tribes, this
Yeah.
is archetypal energies
Yeah.
that have not been. So the great thing about sport is that warring tribes have stadiums now. And you win or lose, and you get this big ornament that you put on desk, and you say, "Oh wow, I won this in 2020."
Instead of killing 10,000 people.
No, the 100,000
Or
millions
whatever.
of people. Yeah, if you're talking about Genghis Khan, you're talking about Hitler. You're talking
Yeah,
about
it's
Pol Pot. If you're talking
it's in
about
the millions.
the Belgian king who massacred.
Yeah, it's in the millions per.
So you're talking about many, but the more these archetypal energies
Right.
are unleashed, and the more there is identification with the archetypal energy, but you still need the spark.
Okay, you know what's really interesting about this that it reminds me of is, okay, Michael Jordan, for example, he inhabited a anti-hero role, actually, and anybody who knows him on his team or those who played against him, and on that level where you could not just interact with him through the TV or whatever, like we used to do. He's very much the anti-hero. He's the bad guy. Now
That's told you guys, but to us in Chicago.
Oh no.
Jordan
I mean his
hero, and the rest of them were lazy asses that needed to get the shit kicked out of them.
Right.
So they could be on the same field with Jordan. So I understand the rest of country were having a hard time with Chicago.
Well, no, even his teammates and everybody who played against him, he embodied this this aggressive, like there's people who win this sportsmanship award who are all like, oh, let me help you up, all this kind of stuff. He was not that guy. Now, Kobe Bryant, on the other hand, he actually learned somewhere early in his career, in the first few years, this mental trick of taking the alter ego and making it separate. And so that's why everybody who knew Kobe, at least after he got through some of his growing up in the first few years,
give me rape charges.
Well, those among other things, and just the development of his personality. Yeah. I'm not saying that he's necessarily a wonderful person or anything else, but
I'm not saying he's the worst either.
He's not the best or the worst. He was just a person. But anyway, what he was able to do is, when it's game time, he inhabited the Black Mamba, and he knew what he was doing. He was becoming the bad guy during those 48 minutes. And then after that, he was a civilized gentleman, which is interesting because that's exactly how you do it when you become very conscious. He was like an integrated person in that sense, and that he would direct his shadow to being very aggressive and dominate during 48 minutes of regulation. And then after that, he's like a civilized gentleman, has a great persona. And so that's like a skill that most people don't develop, but that's a persona shadow control.
But when we talk about Spark, Kobe also needed a lot of people to help him win championships. When we're talking about Spark, we're talking about Jordan, who lit fires under people who shouldn't be waitering around him.
Yeah.
That's what we talk about Spark.
Yeah.
When we talk about somebody like Mark Paxson, I mean, minimal player at best. We had people who sat on bench all the time. He would make them look like they were all-stars when they got on field, because everybody was chasing him.
Oh yeah, Steve Kerr.
So they would start dunking. They would it was like, where do you have all these tricks? If they have one person on them, they cannot do that.
Right.
But because they're free in the stadium,
Mhm.
there is a spark. It's a spark. You see it everywhere.
Right.
But it's only in like it's very few numbers in population.
Mhm.
And you see it and you look at it and it's complete identification with the archetype.
Right.
The archetypal energy drives you. So when I saw um, the documentary on the Bulls with Jordan, because I lived in that city and we breathed and we ate Jordan because
Yeah, it's in the air.
no, 6 months out of the year, we were frozen. So
Yeah.
there was nothing else to do. You ran from place to place. If you went to a bar, you ran to a bar. You didn't walk to a bar. You couldn't walk to a bar. You'd freeze by the time you get to the bar. And if you were drunk inside the bar, when you run out, you're not drunk anymore. You're just frozen.
Mhm.
So we had Jordan. So anyway,
Yeah.
but I was watching him as he told story. He looked angry. He looked bitter. He looked disappointed. He looked lost and he looked sad. That energy was gone.
Yeah.
That spark that made that team something incredible was gone. That spark, he did not translate it in a way that made sense. So he felt the loss of the spark of the energy.
Well, yeah. Well, also it's because he was able to embody the warrior archetype that way, and it's not the same, doing so as a owner or anything else that you do after you retire from a sport. Um, so, what do you think, Kieran?
So what I think is I'd like to maybe have you go into what you're saying about Kobe Bryant. You're saying that
Mhm.
you said, he had during the game, you were calling it shadow, but would you say it's persona? He had a specific persona for the game and then a specific
It's an
persona for
alter.
off the court, or do you want to throw in the word shadow there? Because when I think of persona, I think of
It's
it
alter.
adapting to physical and social environments.
Yeah, so it's an alter ego, and he would even call it that, almost like Batman puts on his bat mask and all that stuff, and then he's no longer Bruce Wayne. And Kobe even called it that. He's like, "This is my alter ego. I become Black Mamba," and he actually got that from right after Kill Bill came out. One of the Black Mamba
using the
assassins.
Jungian terms.
That's tricky. I don't know. Did Jung ever talk about an alter ego? Because
Splitting is very common within the unconscious.
yeah. Well,
he's conscious of these.
Yeah. So
these aren't unconscious.
He's conscious of the split.
Right. So
he's saying this has a different character and I'm going to give it a different name. He's conscious of the split. He's not. He doesn't. He doesn't have to be conscious of the person on the court. He might not remember a lot of the things.
Right. It's just like a haze. Yeah. So it's a little the way that he operated in it, I guess, is a little bit different, maybe than Jungian terms. A lot of other psychology might use this kind of terminology of the alter ego effect, which is in Jungian psychology, just a bit different. But now what he's doing specifically, to kind of put it in Jungian terms, I would almost think of it as the way that Carl Jung would try to get his patients or analysans to operate in their individuation art, and that he wants them to, whatever that they're doing, painting or whatever else that they're doing creatively or in their career, to do so flowing from the unconscious. And so when he would step into that mode of a alter ego, which is almost like a shadow integration or taking on a different persona, then it's a flowing of it, and flowing is really the right word too, because it brings about a flow state, and it's about inhabiting the archetype, or letting the archetype inhabit the individual, and then that can flow through and accomplish things that a person wouldn't be able to do otherwise. So and I bring up this example too that just came to mind just because this is sort of how that you would, because that's how that a lot of players are not very good. Like Lahab was mentioning some Bulls players that weren't very good, but they could kind of be good around Michael Jordan, for example. But that's because they were like over identified with their normal persona. But if you take on a persona that's gonna be like, I'm gonna knock you on your butt, I'm gonna, dunk on you, whatever, that's gonna feel kind of rude, but it's this different persona during competition.
Yes, exactly, Isaac.
Okay.
Keep it simple. His persona shifts based on the situation. When he's on the court, his persona is court Kobe. I'm a slay, and I'm gonna slay all day. And then when he's off the court, he adapts that persona, which was the friendly or more like team player or whatever.
Yeah.
So just talking about how your persona can shift and change based on societal expectations. But I think like you were definitely going deep into how some people are better at doing that than others. And he was really, really good at
some
it.
people
he could read,
develop that.
Yeah, that might be a whole different conversation outside of.
Well, like, okay.
Hold on. Let Karen finish.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I was just thinking that what you're talking about might be outside of the scope of this chapter of just the basics of like this is persona, this is shadow, but just trying to keep it on the basic level.
Well, Stein talks about when we go into different milieu, which is this word meaning like social environment, we put on different personas, and a lot of times it's unconscious. And he gave some examples, Stein, in this chapter of like he had one friend that would be a certain way when he's like this manager at his workplace, and then when he's home or private or in other settings, he would kind of be the opposite, not necessarily in a bad way, but just one persona would work well in one setting, and then one would be coming out differently because that's where he's at, whether it's home or in private or whatever.
Ego, he said the persona would be the person who's out there, gregarious, extroverted, connected, being nice to everybody, and coming home, reading kind of the paper, not talking to anybody.
He gave a few examples.
Negative,
yeah.
I don't know that he necessarily said that those were unconscious
no, he said that's
changes.
the ego.
Well, okay, so like what Lahab was mentioning was some examples of what people do, and they're usually unconscious of it. I was kind of thinking of one example Stein gave in the chapter where he referred to a specific friend of his, where he said his friend was in the workplace, and I'd have to look it up. I have the digital.
Okay, I got it.
But in the workplace, he was like this liberal, fit in with the social situations of how that corporate situation should be, and he had like the perfect persona that he dialed in with it, and he was conscious of the fact that not necessarily a negative way, but at home or in private or in other situations, he would kind of like let his hair down, so to speak. And what's that?
He didn't believe in it.
Yeah,
he had a different belief altogether, and that was not the belief. That was kind of part of.
He calls it a functional persona.
Yeah. So it's, which is almost, when I brought up that example because it's sort of similar to the Kobe example, where somebody goes into a specific workplace or milieu, as Stein put it in the chapter, and then you put on what you sort of feel like is the best persona for that situation. Some people are more conscious of it than others. Some people are completely unconscious of it. They're like, what? I did that. I didn't know I did that. So it depends on the person, and so and the situation.
Page 113 for those following along at home.
Oh yes, thank you for those following along.
But that's totally that. I'm following you. That makes sense for sure.
Yeah.
It is something like, I feel like as kids, there's like sometimes there can be their persona at home with their parents, and then there's the persona they adopt when they're at school, which may be different because they're outside of that home environment.
All right.
Dr. Lahab, you work with kids. Is that something
that's usually where persona development begins? But yeah, go ahead, Lahab.
Well, so they use the home as the theater.
Yeah.
and they will try out different things with their parents because they feel safe. And so this is what is called play. You know, they'll try to dress up or do things or act in a certain way and see what they get away with, see what's encouraged and what's given a high five. And they will continue to do that because it's being reinforced, right?
Yeah,
So
because
that,
their parents are the source of life at that point. That's where they get everything. And then on the other hand, some and even Stein went into this example of how birth order actually goes into this. How the oldest will sometimes be like the little adult, and then the youngest will be like the little, kid playing jokes and games all the time, getting attention. And then the middle child will often be like the mediator, or if they get caught in it, maybe they'll kind of be disconnected in some ways or find other ways to deal with things. So it all goes
well, the
into
middle
persona
child doesn't
development.
get as much attention. So they have
Right.
to create ways to gather attention because the youngest child is taking all the way the positive attention. The oldest child is taking away all the negative attention. So the middle child is stuck with trying to create intention.
Which is also strange too, because for a period of time that maybe the child doesn't even remember, they were the young child, the youngest.
Of course.
And so then they get dethroned, so to speak, but by the new one, and then they have to take on this new role or this new adaptive persona, or
But the oldest
role.
doesn't get dethroned.
Yeah, the oldest is still the little adult.
Yeah.
The oldest always knows that this is their territory. Anybody else is infringing. You end up taking care of the others because you find your task. You start to be disagreeable with the caretakers that you have because they've given you more problems than answers.
Yeah, that's why for so many hundreds or thousands of years, people would build up their wealth, and it was just without question, oh, the oldest just gets everything, or at least gets the
male oldest.
Yeah, and not that was okay, but it was just like a natural thing to come to mind, a natural role to inhabit. And so now we have kind of gone away from that thousands of years later or whatever.
Well, it's an unfair system. I mean, even though I am the oldest, but it's an unfair system that discriminates against the children who are left behind and makes them feel less than the other children because they grew up in the same family. They grew up with these crazy people. Why shouldn't they get a piece of whatever is left?
Yep. So it all develops well, and that dynamic can develop both persona, and then with that, like you're just mentioning, like, oh, why shouldn't I get some of that? That develops some resentment, and that little like root of bitterness or that resentment, however much that it might be founded and they might be right, like in that culture, for example, there's stories about this for thousands of years where the oldest would just get things, and then the younger would be resentful for it, these hostile brothers motifs, and then that would cause shadow that would sometimes cause these huge dramas that would be played out for thousands of years, whether that it was like one murdered the other or whatever that we still see played out in our literature and films today. So it's that persona creating a shadow. It's like the opposite of the ego. Like one side
the
is
shadows, so the shadow is already created.
Yeah.
So because I think our language, I mean, I understand what you're saying, but just to clarify our language. So they are all, what Stein says is at the beginning, he says, when you're born into wholeness, where nothing is differentiated, or you're not, everything is in the unconscious. You're not differentiated. There's no consciousness.
Right.
So I think to clarify what I was saying, because I also get what he was saying, I think the word is the realization of the shadow. So the shadow is already there, but then it's realized. So just from page 122, I'm going to read. We tend to feel either guilty about or profoundly ashamed of the things we do that are at odds with the adopted persona. This is the realization of shadow in the personality. And shadow induces shame, a sense of unworthiness, a feeling of uncleanliness, of being soiled and unwanted.
Yeah, he drew a really interesting distinction between this that was toward the end of the chapter where he got into the distinction between the Eastern view is more of one of shame and of losing face. So if you look at civilized Eastern culture, especially in Japan and those that are very uh, ultra civilized Taoist cultures, um, there's nothing wrong with them, but they're just different in that everything's about keeping face. Like that's literally how it translates, keeping face. And then if that face breaks, or if it shows uh the wrong face, the shadow face, then it's total shame, and including, I forget all the names for it, but it's it's then honorable that you kill yourself.
This is identification with the persona.
Right.
It's identification with the archetype.
Mm-hmm.
And in a lot of cultures, we identify with the archetype. I mean, in Western culture, the archetype is money. And Stein talks about that too.
Right.
So there's more identification with money than there is with identification with keeping face or keeping family or keeping whatever.
Well, so that was the aspect of how in the East now it is, or it's been for a while, this shame aspect, which is like, if you lose face, you're as good as dead, or maybe you should be. Whereas in the West, which isn't necessarily better, it's just different. It's a guilt culture, which means that if you show your shadow, or you do something quote unquote evil or uncivilized, there is a place for redemption, and that has its pros and cons. And so a lot of times in the Western culture, what that does is there's a lot of this whole like, hey, look, I'm uncivilized. Oh, like, that's silly. Don't worry about that. Forget about it. And so there's some of that like strange sort of disassociation in Western culture where it's like okay to do certain things because it's like, oh, we're in almost like, oh, we're in a guilt culture. That's just my shadow. Or it's just boys will be boys, or whatever, people will be people. And so just a different dynamic in how to identify with the persona and the uncivilized aspects of ourselves, which is what he was getting into toward the end of the chapter.
Yeah, it was
Karen,
super interesting.
go on with that.
Oh, so
Karen.
oh yeah, it sounded like you had a tidbit there or thought, Karen.
No, I just thought, I agree, like it was super interesting, the difference between the East and the West, and the guilt versus shame, and how that shows up in the shadow and how it affects us.
So they've just flipped though, Karen. Think of it that way. So in the West, it's guilt and shame. First guilt, then shame. In the East, it's shame, then guilt. So they're just on their opposite sides.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the other interesting thing, that because he was writing this in the 90s, I think something that we've seen in the 21st century is where the world is now more integrated, where in America, for example, perhaps in other Western cultures, but at least in America, we're very diverse in that in some areas, some individuals, some families, some cities or whatever, they will be more shame oriented, and then others might be more guilt oriented, or whether that's they have whatever culture for whatever reason, maybe they have had an Eastern influence or they had a Western influence or a mix or whatever. Some people and some like groups of people will be more one or the other in America, but it ends up being like a mix of both these days, as we're kind of like turning into this big melting pot.
Karen, you were finishing your thought.
Oh no, we're in line. Yeah, totally. I do want to talk about how, and generally speaking, there's negative association with the shadow, or people say it's the bad, and you're definitely trying to differentiate between that verbiage, Dr. Lahab. And there's a couple lines in the chapter where Stein states that once the person actually becomes conscious. Like there's a great fear in that the shadow is really terrible, but it's actually probably not as bad as the person imagines. And I don't know, that kind of made me feel good. It kind of made me feel fuzzy.
Sure.
Like exposing it may not actually be the end of the world.
No.
But there's a lot of fear that it might be.
Well,
Or
it's in the shadow just because we said it was. And so if you stop saying it's in the shadow, you know, this is like the whole thing of like, you know, a certain sexual orientation, certain races, certain people with disabilities, and all this that in the past were sometimes they would get put in the shadows, like even, you know, lepers for a long time, and all this where
get projected on as the
yeah,
other, which is the shadow usually.
right,
Because we don't want to identify with them, so we project on them our feelings of we despise them because they are not us, because they make us feel uncomfortable.
right,
Stuff that contained in the shadow.
right. And if you bring it to light, then usually what you'll find is, oh, we're just people. And then sometimes what needs to be done is to figure out how to.
You wouldn't want to do that with Hannibal Lecter. You wouldn't want to bring it to light and say we're just people, because he would have you for supper. Not everybody's going to come to that conclusion. If you sit with the shadow long enough, if you've had interactions with somebody who's identified with the shadow, the first thing you feel is the hair on the back of your neck stand.
Oh yeah. I mean, there's definitely people that they are super identified with the shadow, and they are all about shadow and evil and killing and eating people and everything else. And of course, there's no like, all right, go ahead and eat people. It's just your shadow. But the sort of like redemption for those guilty people, even if it's a guilty conscience because they just thought about eating people or whatever, is the fact that those energies or those feelings or those thoughts can be manifested in different ways. So in other words, if you're dealing with a person that wants to eat people, you can teach them how to eat people through reading and writing or through art or maybe through sports and not hurt people.
Twitter.
Yeah, some people do it through Twitter and Facebook, but it's better if they
Twitter more than Facebook. Twitter.
Yeah, probably. I don't go on Twitter a lot, but it's better. Yeah, it's a cesspool of shadow junk. And well, that's the worst thing about those sites is most of the people that are behaving that way in a troll-like evil manner through Twitter and Facebook or whatever, they would never, ever do it in person. But they do it on the internet because through a screen, especially if it's just like type out 140 characters or whatever, then it's like there's no attachment to it. Where it's like, even if it was a screen with some faces on it like this, they probably wouldn't do it. And especially like in a room of human beings that can look at them and be like, ew, I can't believe you said that. They wouldn't do it because our empathy, mirror neurons and everything else wire us to like know when we're saying something totally uncivilized and repugnant. So the internet really breeds shadow projection. Yikes.
Okay, let me read from page 123.
Okay.
Good. The personal aspects of which one is ashamed are often felt to be radically evil. While some things truly are evil and destructive, frequently shadow material is not evil. It is only felt to be so because of the shame attached to it due to its non-conformity with the persona.
Right.
So shine the light on it.
So that's why I say the archetypal energies are neither good nor evil. They're both. They hold potentiality for both. They could interact in both.
Yep. Well, and I'll say on this note, something
dominant and destructive. The ego has shown that by people building huge towers while populations go hungry.
Yeah.
I mean, that's ego. Ego has destructive powers, just like persona has destructive powers. just like shadow has destructive powers. What we're saying is there are all kinds of powers contained within psyche, within what is not hidden, what is hidden, and what is concealed. There is all these type of things that are occurring within us. And these energies are basically what take us to the store and back.
Yeah.
And it's amazing that they're under some kind of um, uh, basically like a traffic cop called ego. Okay, you go. No, you go. Okay, you go. Hold on, hold on. No, you went too far. Step back, step back. Okay, persona, you take care of it. I mean, it's like, so there is a relationship. That's why when we talk about ego integrity, the more the ego is not strong enough to hold these opposing forces within the unconscious and be able to maneuver them in ways that make them more adaptive for the being, the more likely dangerous elements within the person is going to come out. It's all about
They can't contain the energy.
They can't contain the energies, and they overwhelm.
Gotta go somewhere.
Yeah, and so it acts itself out.
Yeah. So like a negative example are like the obvious ones. Like it starts off as just like hate towards your parents, and that one day projects onto society. I hate authority figures, and then one day it's like I hate people, and then killing people or whatever. That's an example of how it can like build up and manifest in a definitely evil, negative way. But sometimes it's sort of the opposite, and it's like a person feels drawn to be a writer, for example, or be a podcaster, or be a particular artistic thing, whatever the case is, to help people whichever way. But then because they feel like, oh no, I'm not that kind of personality, or I'm not that kind of whatever to help people be around, like that's like not my ego, my persona or whatever. But then sometimes what happens is they take up that role eventually, and then it's almost like a built up shadow comes out, and it manifests really well. That's how that sometimes you see people who for a long time were not writers or artistic people, but then they become that later in life because that was like a built up energy, and it comes out as positive. Same thing even happen. Yeah. So it's like the shadow element is just that which was repressed.
Not known.
Right. It was repressed because we said it was wrong. And sometimes that can be positive, just like a wealthy person is often wealthy because they were stingy. But so then sometimes what happens, not that it necessarily just justifies their years of stinginess, but then in their like later life, they will become super benevolent and giving to the world because that was like stored up. So sometimes it can be definitely a positive thing that comes out.
Or they could die eating cat food.
Yeah.
We've seen the opposite occur.
Right. And like I said, that doesn't necessarily mean like, oh, what a wonderful person. Thank God that they stored up their stinginess. It's just the ways that these energies build up and then project into reality.
Oh, I like the positive spin they did on the storing up of like the writer, like, oh, they didn't know, it was unconscious to them that they had this energy. They kind of denied it, like, oh, I'm not good enough to write, or maybe whatever they told themselves. And then it like just burst through, and then they were able to use that energy, and it became their maybe persona, I don't know, but it's no longer hidden. It's no longer in the shadow. So that could be like something that was in the shadows that's now not in the shadow. That's positive versus always thinking of it as a negative.
Right. Well, that's shadow integration. And so sometimes like I gave the example of like Robert Greene, who's an author that I like, where he says he writes out of anger, which sometimes people don't like that particular writing style or whatever, but it's effective in some ways. But what it was is that he had this stored up like things that he doesn't like in the world, and then he makes his writing very dynamic in his storytelling and everything else. Uh, so there's different ways that we can uh, store up our archetypal energy and then let it flow out. Uh, anyway, we're almost out of time. What do you think, Karen?
I don't think the archetypal energy flows out. I think the way the energy.
We jump in.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's exactly what happens. We jump in. We always jump in.
Mm.
But we've discussed, I think, to think about what we've discussed. We've discussed the three components of what he calls concealed and revealed in
Right.
this chapter. So it's the persona, the ego, and the shadow, which makes this triangle within the self. These are all pieces of the self. These are all because the greater archetype is the self. So these are projections of what Jung terms the self. So there are grand archetypes, and there are smaller archetypes, and there are complexes that are archetypes. So all these things need to be remembered.
Integrated.
Not all archetypes are the same archetype. The queen, warrior, lover, magician archetype, those are grand archetypes. Those are the bigger archetypes. There are smaller archetypes and there are bigger archetypes, according to Jungian theory.
That's why it's a mandala, is because that shows the symbol of how that there's these smaller differentiations, and then ultimately in the middle of it there's that quaternity of a four central differentiation with a unity within it. That's just how that the energies are differentiated, but then ultimately coalesce around a unity.
Yes.
It's just like how consciousness is.
Well, yes.
Divided yet the same.
How the collective and how consciousness.
I mean, it's like
all related.
Right. It's like the body. We have our digestive system, and we got our liver and our heart, and all these things just constantly doing their job, whether we think about it or not. And so it's one body, but it's individual. It has its distinctions, the brain and everything else, the nervous systems working, and although at the same time it's all one thing.
So the queen archetype, when you think about the queen archetype, the energies that the queen archetype commands under her command are affected. The shadow is affected, the persona is affected, and the ego is affected. So the queen archetype not only affects them, but it also channels them to do different things. The more she is individuated, the more she is able to adapt them for her own needs. Just throwing that out there for fun.
By the way, you focus on that quaternity, or whatever you want to call it, that archetype of four a lot, but wasn't something that Carl Jung talked about himself a lot. Was that from Robert Moore, or who came up with that originally?
Well, Gillette and Moore came up, wrote the books, but they got that from Jung.
Okay.
Those are from the original archetypes. The great father, the great mother,
right?
The lover, the warrior. All those were included. He talked about all of them.
Yeah.
But you also think about the mother and father complex.
Right.
So the mother and father complex are huge complexes, but they are contained within the larger archetype.
Yeah, it divides and unifies.
Yes, exactly.
Nice.
Okay, with that, we would like to bid you farewell. Thank you for listening to us for another episode of the Institute for Conflicts Individuation podcast with the Daily Archetype and Isaac J. Miller, Karen Apple. I will let them say adieu in their own way. I am Dr. Lahab El Samurai. Thank you for being with us for another week. Karen?
And I'm Karen Apple, naturopathic medical student who has only 179 days till graduation,
Mm,
for those keeping count.
yes,
That's less than 6 months.
I am keeping count. Thank you for saying 6 months to everybody. Isaac,
So next week we're going to get into the Anima and Animus, which is the way to the deep interior. So it will be interesting stuff. These, by the way, last week I mentioned how I thought the chapter had archetypes in the subtitle to the chapter that we would be getting into more of these specifics of it, but we're kind of doing it in these later chapters 5, 6, 7, 8, where we talk about the specific archetypes, the self, the persona, the shadow, the anima, animus, and some others that we'll get into in the next few weeks. But yeah, interesting, fun stuff, and this has been great. So when everybody hears this, enjoy the holidays of the new year, and we will talk to people later.
we'll see everybody in 2021. May all of you be vaccinated by then so we could party.
All right, party hard.
Always